And welcome to another Warrior Creed live stream with me, the radical Majid Nawaz. And today we discuss the suitably dubbed by the man himself, Donroe Doctrine. That is an amalgamation from the word Don, the Don, referring to Donald Trump, and the Monroe Doctrine, a well established US foreign policy doctrine. And of course, how this relates to the recent operation in Venezuela to detain, to extradite or rendition extraordinarily and detain the former president of Venezuela, Maduro. We're going to explain exactly what's happened, cut through all the fuss, and get directly to the doctrinal precedents within US foreign policy that explain what has just happened and provide a framework, an analytical or strategic analytical framework for our regulars and new viewers and listeners to use so that they are able to interpret exactly what has gone on between the US and Venezuela and how the American continents will be shaped in the future with Trump's newly established Donroe Doctrine. So all of that is coming up. We'll be breaking all this down for you over the course of the next hour. Stay with us. This is The Radical for the Warrior Creed podcast.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
And welcome back to the Warrior Creed podcast with the radical, me, Majid Nawaz. And we, as explained, are going to be discussing today the Donroe Doctrine and breaking down exactly what it means for the new Americas. On your screens right about now should be the title for today's stream. And you should be able to see adequately or suitably titled the Donroe Doctrine, Venezuela, Maduro, and the American supercontinent. That is what we're about to explain. Of course, the events of this week require no further introduction, well known and global as they are by now. But nevertheless, here is the announcement that the White House put forward regarding the entering of, the rendering of, and then the detention of the former president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Here, the White House posts, the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow. There will be a news conference today. That's on the day that it happened at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. Thank you for your attention to this matter, signed President Donald Trump. And there underneath it is the post on Truth Social made by Trump himself. The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow. So that's Trump's own announcement, mimicked as it was then by the White House official Twitter account. Keep in mind, Trump announces all such things first on his own social media, Truth Social, which should have been for many a sign in those early days who backed Elon Musk that President Trump never fully wanted to put all his eggs in the basket of that basket case, Elon Musk, but instead made sure to maintain his own communication channels as president, and they were via Truth Social. And all X does now is follow the news agenda politically that Trump sets on his own social media platform, which, by the way, is a very wise strategy considering what happened subsequently between Trump and Musk, despite appearances by now that they seem to have patched their differences up. The key point to remember is Musk is not in charge. Trump is. Trump was always in charge. Musk never was. Now, to the point of the subject today, as we're discussing, it is it's the operation in Maduro. The Trump White House, true to form, has been rather bolshy on its success of its operation. It's a let's call it an in-your-face diplomacy, which again is true to character with Trump, but as we're about to argue over the course of this stream, has a rationale behind it. Some of you may be wondering, what on earth is Trump playing at? Well, that's what we are seeking to explain over the course of this stream, and we're making it very clear that despite appearances, Trump's and despite rhetoric, even we'd argue, Trump's foreign policy is incredibly coherent, internally coherent. Of course, that doesn't mean the rest of the world can see the coherence, but we're going to explain it over the course of this stream. Of course, that also doesn't mean the rest of the world listens to us, shadow banned as we are on all social media platforms. It doesn't matter, because our signal will always be stronger than their noise. And we're going to explain the rationale, which has an internal logic and an internal consistency of Trump's foreign policy over the course of this stream, so that at least by the end of it, whether you agree with it or not, you will be able to understand it. Of course, the secondary question, once understanding it correctly, is whether or not one agrees with it. And that's where we will state our view without, of course, expecting everybody else to, in the rest of the world, to agree with that either. But our view is that this is a policy intervention that is moving along the same trajectory as all of these others, which is to a grand regional settlement for peace. Again, that may sound counterintuitive for many non-followers of radical media, but those of you who are regulars will understand exactly where we're coming from. And those of you who aren't, welcome to the Warrior Creed stream. You'll be, and Happy New Year 2026, we should also add at this point. Those who are new to the stream, or the podcast version of this stream via our premium subscription on Radical Media, should understand one thing, is that the assertions we make, geopolitical analysis that we present, will never come without receipts. We always provide evidence, and in the written version of this stream via the Radical Dispatch, links to that evidence so that you can make your own minds up. We expect nobody to blindly follow Warrior Creed on this platform. We do expect you to follow the evidence. That is the least we expect. Of course, you're perfectly at liberty to look up that evidence for yourselves. But what we're going to argue over the course of this stream, contrary to established and received wisdom by all globalist corporate media, is that Trump's foreign policy is internally consistent, does have a logic, and in fact is the best, not perfect, mind you, neither is the man himself, but the best antidote to the chaos that we currently witness in our world, regardless of motive. Motive and personality matters less in this context than stopping World War III, which is crucially where we are right now. And of course, we also think World War III has been averted. We're not about to enter World War III, but that's largely because of Trump's foreign policy, which we're going to now explain. So the in-your-face or otherwise cowboy diplomacy that Trump has now become known for was put on full and proud display by the White House immediately after this operation. And on your screens now will be a White House post that was from immediately after the Venezuela operation. If you don't know, now you know. That is coining a Biggie Smalls or Notorious B.I.G. track. Of course, how interesting times have become that the White House is now officially posting hip-hop after the extraordinarily rendered president of Venezuela, former president, was detained and taken to New York. New York rapper Notorious B.I.G. forms the backdrop to this video officially posted by the White House, which you're about to see now.
Venga por mí. Aquí lo esperan Miraflores. No se tarde en llegar, cobarde.
And now, if you don't know, now you know.
Sicker than your average. Papa twist cabbage on instinct. Niggas don't think shit stink. Pink gators. My Detroit players.
Of course, that's the in-your-face diplomacy that you should come to become accustomed to, that will be coming from the Trump administration. It is a open and quote unquote honest, because we appreciate some of you may not like that word, but what we mean by honest is unabashed foreign policy that is not hiding behind a pretense or a cloak using the language of democracy and human rights, as the globalist neocons attempted to do. Trump's administration distinguishes itself from the neocons by making two core elements critical in their foreign policy, public diplomacy, at least. And that is, number one, they are avowedly anti-war and anti-starting any new wars, such as invading countries, which is why we don't think that the US will invade Iran. And without an invasion, the Iranian theocracy will not collapse, though pressure it may feel, it will adjust to that pressure, even if there are strikes, as happened last time. But the collapse of the Iranian regime is unexpected. Reason being is because regimes such as those in Iran that are ideologically coherent rarely collapse, even if the leader falls. A new individual rises up to take that leader's place. And it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. Any regime or system that is ideologically coherent, whether that's the Iranian theocracy with the Islamist theocratic ideology, or indeed Britain and America, that is ideologically coherent in a free and open society, regardless. And of course, the word free there is doing some heavy lifting, but you get the point. Free in the sense of personal liberties, in as so far as they are permitted, but still freer than the Iranian theocracy. Any system that is ideologically coherent pretty much insulates and guarantees itself against regime change without an external invasion. And so the first pillar, with that small anecdote aside, the first pillar of Trump's foreign policy is no wars. And the second could be articulated as unabashed intervention where America's key or critical national security interests are concerned. And the Venezuela example is one example of the many that are available. You could look to others, but we will stick to the Venezuela one for now. But of course, the bombing in Nigeria after the official invitation of the Nigerian government to do so is another such example, when they bomb the north of Nigeria to take out ISIS strongholds. So they are, yes, anti-war, which means by definition anti-invading countries, but they are not anti-intervention, such as foreign strikes that have some form of customary or doctrinal backing. In the case of Venezuela, the Monroe Doctrine is very well established US foreign policy. It was just neglected for a long, long time by the globalists, because what they preferred instead was in fact a neoconservative invasion imperialist policy. Now, that isn't the Monroe Doctrine, and in fact, contrary to so-called anti-imperialist or hard left, regressive left commentary, the Monroe Doctrine is actually not an imperialist neocon doctrine. It's the opposite of an imperialist neocon doctrine, which we're about to explain. And the globalist hitherto rulers of the United States, up until the Trump phenomenon and MAGA came along, had abandoned the Monroe Doctrine to become neocon imperialists. But actually, the Monroe Doctrine is a retreat from neocon imperialism to a consolidation of an American sphere of influence that stays within the Americas. We're going to explain all of that. So don't worry if it sounds a bit complicated, but that's we need to explain that in steps. So first, our immediate reaction to what Trump did by extraordinarily rendering the former president of Venezuela, Maduro. We're going to go to our immediate reaction on Twitter by way of an introduction, and then break it down for everybody over the course of this stream. So you can see on your screens now was our immediate reaction, which at the time was breaking news. Of course, it's not anymore, but nevertheless, this is the post that we put up at the time. We were in the US when these events unfolded. We are, of course, back home in our London studio, as you can see. So we should, by the way, wish everybody a belated Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, as we already said, Happy New Year, but say it again. This is our first stream of 2026. We're very proud to continue streaming for the Warrior Creed live stream, and we thank all of our regular subscribers for their support. You can subscribe over at majidnawaz.substack.com. And without your paying subscriptions on our Radical Media page on Substack, we cannot do this work. So thank you all to our regular subscribers. Here's to 2026. We also would like a special thanks at this stage to our founding members, for whom we organized, those of you listening will know, for whom we organized an end-of-year private dinner with myself in a London private location. And the founding members who came, those who are living in London, we thank you very much for your support. And those who couldn't make it from outside of London, we will organize other such events, not just for founding members, but also paying subscribers as well, so that they can be a direct relationship with the work that we do. Now, our immediate reaction to Trump's operation should be on your screens now, and we're going to read it for you, and then, as we say, break it down as we go over the course of this stream. So, breaking: U.S. military under Trump captures and detains Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. News conference expected at 11 a.m. Venezuela's now former leader, Maduro, is accused by the U.S. of sitting at the top of a loose, keyword there, loose, narco-military network named Cartel de los Soles, responsible for shipping tons of cocaine into the USA. Maduro was charged with narco trafficking by the DOJ back in 2020. The name Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, named after the Venezuelan military patch depicting a sun, was first used to describe the informal narco-military network back in 1993, when the Venezuelan military's anti-drug national command under General Ramon Guillen Davila collaborated with the CIA to ship cocaine into the US. The corrupted CIA has admitted to poor judgment in this drug trafficking incident. Here are the receipts. This will be obviously linked up in the written version of this stream, the Radical Dispatch. This is but one of the multiple allegations inside Venezuela and around the world of the CIA collaborating with narco cartels to ship hard drugs into the US. The CIA, of course, has always denied such allegations. Now, crucially, the following is what we think is going on, because, of course, remember, the drug trafficking element was the ostensible reason provided by the Trump administration. The DOJ has dropped the charges of drug trafficking when it comes to Maduro. And even that case that we mentioned was from 1993. So what we then explained in our immediate reaction, despite the fact that that was the official version put out by the Trump administration and since been dropped, we explained what we thought was what was really going on. And this is what we think was really going on in the last two paragraphs. It appears that this surgical intervention by Trump is part of a larger understanding with world powers for realigned spheres of influence. Now, remember this word, spheres of influence. We're going to come back to it when we explain to you what the Monroe Doctrine, or dubbed as the Donroe Doctrine by Donald Trump himself, and what that establishes in terms of spheres of influence. But we've used the word here. It appears that this surgical intervention by Trump is part of a larger understanding with world powers for realigned spheres of influence between them, with the acquiescence that the South Americas form part of a key U.S. zone of control. Trump seeks to clean up the devastating drugs epidemic that has so plagued the U.S. in recent years, contain the domestic and global chaos caused by a rogue CIA, while also availing the opportunity to realign U.S. and Venezuelan interests. So that's the key point there, that this is in fact a realigning of Venezuela to U.S. interests, which is in line with the original Monroe Doctrine and the corollary established to the Monroe Doctrine by President Roosevelt. Now, the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is crucial because it critically involves Venezuela itself. When Roosevelt adapted the Monroe Doctrine by adding a corollary, it was after a particular crisis in Venezuela that required U.S. intervention. So all of this has historical precedent and therefore internal consistency and logic when it comes to a U.S. perspective on what their foreign policy is, despite the gapes and the disbelief by European leaders and other globalist powers around the world, and indeed even so-called anti-imperialist regressive leftists, in reality, client states for Russia and China and the BRICS nations. Despite their incredulity at what Trump's done, it does have internal logic and internal consistency, which we will continue to establish over the course of this stream. Now, with regards to the drugs element, keep in mind, as we said, that has been dropped. So as reported by Dropsite News, quoting from the New York Times itself, this is the update on the drugs element. The U.S. Justice Department has quietly dropped its earlier claim that Venezuela's Cartel de las Soles is a formal drug cartel led by President Nicolas Maduro. The revised indictment, unsealed after Maduro's capture, shows, according to the New York Times. The DOJ still accuses him of participating in drug trafficking, but reframes the Cartel de las Soles as a loose patronage system and culture of corruption tied to any drug money, not an actual organization. So, the original claim, first advanced in a 2020 indictment and later used to justify terrorism designations by the Trump administration, had long been criticized by experts as lacking any evidence. The shift raises new questions about the legitimacy of those designations. And here's the New York Times headline: Justice Department drops claim that Venezuela's Cartel de las Soles is an actual group. but rather are now reframing it as a loose organization. Remember our immediate reaction and where we use the word loose: cartel. And we said to you, that is the operative word there. And that is what subsequently has been adapted to by the DOJ. We've got it back on your screen. So our immediate reaction is the one that the DOJ eventually ran with. It is not an actual formalized cartel. Cartel indicates organized crime, an organized criminal gang, such as that was run by, let's say, Pablo Escobar, the most infamous of the cartel leaders, the most daring, perhaps one of the first to set up a transnational cartel from Colombia. Of course, subsequently succeeded in his ferocity and organizational capacity by the since detained. So, of course, Pablo Escobar is dead. But in Mexico, the since detained in America, El Chapo, who founded the Sinaloa cartel and succeeded in Pablo Escobar in terms of his ferocity, cruelty, and transnational organizational capacity. But those cartels were organized hierarchical structures. The Cartel of the Suns from Venezuela was always a loose network, and that's why we use the word in our immediate reaction that it was a loose narco-military network. That is now and that's on your screens now. Our immediate reaction was subsequently confirmed by the DOJ dropping charges, because of course when something's a loose network, you can't bring organized cartel style charges against somebody because it simply isn't an organized cartel. So the DOJ did the right thing there, because it wouldn't have succeeded. And of course, the reaction by Drop Site News, claiming that it subsequently hinders the credibility of Trump's operation, misses the point, because it was never the point of the Trump's operation to focus on the Cartel de las Solas. Of course, the DOJ charges from 2020 were window dressing, providing a public diplomacy pretext for the operation, but the real context was described by Trump in his own press conference, and that is the Donroe Doctrine, formally introduced by Trump. And as ABC News reports, which is on your screens now, and we'll read it for you, on the 6th of Jan, Trump's Donroe Doctrine seeks influence over Western Hemisphere, citing old policy. By the way, it's the cartoon of the stream there on your screens now. That cartoon is precisely the point. That is, you can see the Donroe Doctrine in effect there. That is Donald Trump, standing astride the entire Americas, north and south, going from Canada, Alaska, in fact, across Canada. Key point is he's astride Canada, all the way down to the bottom of South America. The only thing missing there is if he had a tail, he would be tapping Greenland with it as well. That is the Donroe Doctrine as best articulated in this political cartoon, which, by the way, was also posted out formally by the White House. Remember, as we said, they are unabashed. They don't care what you think. They're not pretending that they care for democracy and human rights. They are telling you very straight and directly that what they care for is preserving American interests in their direct sphere of influence, which is the Americas, which is precisely what the Monroe Doctrine is about, which we're going to come to now. So ABC reported from the day, which should be on your screens now. There's the headline, 6th of Jan. Trump's Donroe Doctrine seeks influence over Western Hemisphere, citing old policy. We're just going to read this for you. In a triumphant news conference following the capture on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in the middle of the night last week, President Donald Trump invoked what he called the Donroe Doctrine, his vision of a U.S. superpower that could assert its military might to conquer the Western Hemisphere. Key point here, by the way, before everyone gets alarmed, the word Western Hemisphere there does not refer to the entire West. The Western Hemisphere here is a technical geographic term referring to the Americas, North and South, and anything attached to those Americas, North and South. That is what they mean in the context of the Monroe Doctrine by the Western Hemisphere. They do not mean Europe. They do not mean Britain. They do not mean Russia. They do not mean the Mediterranean. They mean the Americas. And it's why you begin to understand the internal logic of Trump's foreign policy when you continue to understand what the Monroe Doctrine is. So we'll read from that ABC article. The State Department doubled down on the sentiment, posting on Twitter on Monday, "This is our hemisphere, and President Trump will not allow our security to be threatened." Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested as much during cable hits over the weekend, saying, "This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be a base of operation for adversaries, competitors, and rivals of the United States." That is, in effect, the resurrect. So what we're witnessing here is the resurrected Monroe Doctrine, insofar as it applies in 2026. What you've just heard, we've read from ABC News, both Trump's statement and the Secretary of State Rubio's statement, does not contradict the Monroe Doctrine, but it does adapt it slightly. And we explain how in a minute. But first, the Trump announcement on this, donning it himself, as the Don is expected to do these days, as the Donroe Doctrine. Humility, of course, not being his strongest trait, but as I once said to a friend, perfectly understandable, because none of the successes of Trump's foreign policy are recognized by any of the globalist corporate media establishment, nor by committees such as the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, leaving him to champion the successes of his own foreign policy himself via his own media platforms such as Truth Social and his own press conferences. That is contextually understandable if the entire world, run by the globalist media as it is in perpetual denial due to its TDS of Trump's foreign policy successes. It's like we do the same. If you go to our social media accounts and you see us constantly reiterating where we have successfully forecast world events since LBC cancelled us in 2021 and 2 for opposing every single COVID mandate, and then since our Joe Rogan podcast appearance, episode 18, what was it? 18 something, in end of Jan 2022, our Joe Rogan episode, in which we forecasted everything that would happen from COVID mandate period onwards, because nobody ever gives us credit for being consistently accurate. We often take to reminding our audience where we have successfully forecast the entire last 5 years, down to a granular detail. Because when you're denied consistent acknowledgement for being right, the only option you're left with is to remind people this is where we got it right, so please listen to us next time. And that can be well-intentioned. The good intention there is to say, look, if you want to avoid World War III, you should perhaps start listening to those people who are actively making progress in avoiding World War III. And Trump is one of them. Here is his immediate press conference. Let's take you to it now so you can understand from the man himself that this was a consistent approach to US foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine, dubbed by Donald Trump now as the Donroe Doctrine. This is his press conference from Mar-a-Lago immediately after the Venezuela operation.
All of these actions were in gross violation of the core principles of American foreign policy, dating back more than 2 centuries, and not anymore. All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines, and the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donroe document. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. Won't happen.
Right. So that is let's say a top line summary of the Monroe Doctrine adapted to the Donroe Doctrine. The top line summary is America will never let the Western Hemisphere, in this context, the Americas, come under the influence or sphere of influence of any other great power. That's the key thing to remember. It's been announced by the president himself, and we're going to continue to explain what's going on here. Back to that ABC article, we'll read for you from your screens, and it's on your screens now, and we'll enlarge it so you can all read it along with us. And that is there because it's not new. As ABC says itself, in November, the Trump administration, that's last November 2025. Remember, we're now in January 26, so this was pre-announced. It was telegraphed. In November, the Trump administration released its national security strategy, modeling its policy toward the Western Hemisphere after the Monroe Doctrine. Quote, after years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, that means North and South America in this context. And to protect our homeland and our access to key geographies throughout the region, the strategy reads. Continuing, we will deny non-hemispheric competitors. Non-hemispheric competitors means those who are great powers that are not in the Americas. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere per the strategy. This Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests. So key point here, by the way, Trump corollary. Again, we'll come to what corollaries are. Trump later added during his news conference, under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. It won't happen. So just in concluding, for decades, other administrations have neglected or even contributed to these growing security threats in the Western Hemisphere. Under the Trump administration, we are reasserting American power in a very powerful way in our home region. That was all announced last November. And the Trump corollary is in addition to the Roosevelt corollary, President Roosevelt, the older president from American history, which was both those now two corollaries to the original Monroe Doctrine. And we'll take you through what the original doctrine was and then what the two corollaries mean for the doctrine. But this was announced last November in this national security strategy, which is on your screens now. The National Security Strategy is published. You can see it. We'll publish a link to it in the written Radical Dispatch, but it's from last November, the National Security Strategy of the United States of America. They effectively telegraphed what they were going to do. It's no secret. And as The Hill also reports on your screens, Trump coins Donroe Doctrine as he explains the Venezuela operation. And it is explained, right? We're going to take you now to the Naval Institute, the U.S. Naval Institute, to help understand what's going on here and explain a bit more about the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, the U.S. Naval Institute is one of those organizations like the U.S. military and so on and so forth that are better placed to explain U.S. military doctrine to people because it's their doctrine. The U.S. Navy, of course, being a key element of the U.S. military, will understand its own foreign policy doctrine. So that's why we're taking you to that source. And this was published on the U.S. Naval Institute last December. That's last month, 2025. And we'll blow it up for you so you can see it. And it's there, Monroe Doctrine Revisited. Fraught U.S. relations with and regarding Venezuela have a long history of conditioning power politics in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, Western Hemisphere in this context does not mean all of the West, right? America isn't about to resurrect under President Trump the neocon imperialist policies of every single president in modern history in living memory up until Trump himself. This is a firm departure from neocon imperialism. Contrary to the hyperbole put out on social media and by hyperventilating globalist commentators, or those who have just been left behind by the rapidly changing world, we make it very clear to you. And of this, we wish to leave absolutely no room for doubt. This is not a return to neocon imperialism. It is the nail in the coffin to neocon imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary, and now the Trump corollary, the Donroe Doctrine, is marking the end of the Bush-Obama uniparty era of neocon imperialism. We're going to explain why. So on your screens again, just to blow it up quickly so we can read it for you from the U.S. Naval Institute, the Monroe Doctrine Revisited, Venezuelan strife then and now. Reading for you, which brings us back to Hegseth, that's Secretary of War. Hegseth's vow to protect the Western Hemisphere, meaning North and South America. His words were laden with geopolitical portent and historical precedent. They also fit with the Commander-in-Chief's views in 2018. So keep in mind something. We're quoting now from Trump's statement in 2018. This has long been a key part of MAGA policy, not just yesterday. It's not erratic. It's well established. The reason, before we continue reading, the reason this appears erratic to a bunch of clueless globalist neocon imperialists is because if you consistently refuse to represent Trump's foreign policy accurately to the world, when he does something, it's going to look erratic because people are not clued in as to what his foreign policy is. So if globalist media are not informing the public as to the internal consistency with Trump's foreign policy, so as to make him look like a madman in order to undermine his administration, then of course it looks erratic. But we're demonstrating to you that this is firmly grounded in established US foreign policy and goes back to even 2018, right? So have a look at this as quoted by the US Naval Institute. In 2018, midway through the his first administration, President Trump told the UN General Assembly, it's not like he's hiding it, right? He's telling the UN General Assembly in his first term, what did he say to them? Well, he said the following. Here in the Western Hemisphere, remember, North and South America is what that means in the context of the Monroe Doctrine. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers. It has been the formal policy of our country since President Monroe that we reject the interference of foreign nations in this hemisphere and in our own affairs. So that's something he was speaking about since 2018. Now, Venezuela was a key part to the adaptation of the Monroe Doctrine, known as the Roosevelt Corollary. We'll come to explain exactly how. Before we do, again, demonstrating this isn't new, right? Last year, remember, we're in January 2025. In January 2025, last year, the New York Post ran a headline using the very term Donroe Doctrine to telegraph exactly where this was going. So we'll show you this. Keep in mind, on your screens now is a New York Post front page that is a year, exactly to the month, a year old, right? Nearly exactly to the day. So in 2 days, it will be a year old to the day. And that is as reported by the Daily News. The New York Post called Trump's statements about annexing Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal the Donroe Doctrine. This is a reworking of the Monroe Doctrine, a concept that the United States has been promoting since the 19th century. According to the Monroe Doctrine, European countries should not interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, i.e. North and South America. Here is the New York Post headline from a year ago, right? We're going to blow that up for you so you can all see it. This is not some erratic new foreign policy that Trump's just off the cuff decided. This is part of his first administration's doctrine. We'd argue why the globalists wanted him out of power, because it undermines neocon imperialism. The globalists are the epitome of neocon imperialism. And so they wanted to get him out before he had a chance to implement all of this. But this is New York Post headline from January last year, right? You can see it blown up on your screens now. The Donroe Doctrine, Trump's vision for hemisphere. And the map on there indicates exactly. Of course, political cartoons are lighthearted, but it does demonstrate the point here. There's an image of Trump holding up a pointer to a map of the Americas, and you can see there Greenland's crossed out. It says in red, our land, right? You can also see Canada crossed out, and it says 51st state. You can see the Gulf of Mexico crossed out, and instead the Gulf of America. And you can see the Panama Canal crossed out, and instead it says Panamaga Canal. Right, it's quite funny, right? So what is this cartoon from a year ago on the front page of the New York Post indicating? It is that Trump has, in retreating from the world in the sense of Iraq and Afghanistan, in cutting loose as he did. Remember, the deal to cut loose from Afghanistan was made in Trump's first term. The implementation of it was done under Biden, and it was horrifically chaotic. But the principle of no longer occupying Afghanistan and giving it to whoever doesn't matter because it's not our business, that principle ended up giving it to the Taliban. But that principle was decided in Trump's first term. So retreating from the world as he has been, right, whether Afghanistan or indeed other countries where he's pulling out US troops, such as Iraq and Syria, allowing their domestic, in the Syria's case, resistance groups to take over, such as the former leader of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and former terrorist designated by the US, now president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. This all indicates that the Trump administration is less concerned with who takes over. They're prepared to do business with whoever will do business with them, because they've understood something. In the real world, in real politics, geopolitics is a transactional affair. And the only way that you can do business is by disregarding the morals of those who come into power in the cultures of their own countries. Anything more than that, such as having a moral view that you must enforce on the morals of those in the countries that you are seeking to influence, such as having a moral view on the Islamism of the Taliban in Afghanistan, that inevitably leads to invasion and occupation, because you have to keep interfering until you're so embroiled that you have to invade to protect your interferences. So the Trump administration has taken a step back from the moralistic view of foreign policy and has instead said, we are transactional. We'll do business with whoever does business with us, but we have some red lines. Our red lines are our back door, which is the Americas. And that brings us to the Monroe Doctrine, and hence this front page from the New York Post a year ago. So that's what's going on here. And now we're going to get into the explanation of the Monroe Doctrine for you. So from the U.S. National Archive website, we have here a nice piece on the Monroe Doctrine entitled Monroe Doctrine 1823. We'll just read the top line. The Monroe Doctrine was articulated in President James Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress on December the 2nd, 1823. The European powers, according to Monroe, were obliged to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States sphere of interest. Keep in mind that we said, remember the word spheres of influence. That's what we're referring to, because in the Monroe Doctrine, it was formalized as a sphere of interest. The entire Western Hemisphere, North and South America, was formalized as a United States of America sphere of interest. And it was a declaration to the world by President Monroe then to the European colonial powers to stay out. In 1823, a declaration was made to stay out of the Americas, otherwise face the United States of America's wrath. So this was announced by none other than a former president of the United States of America in 1823. To continue reading, the Monroe Doctrine is the best known U.S. policy toward the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, buried in a routine annual message delivered to Congress by President James Monroe in December 1823. The doctrine warns European nations that the United States would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. The doctrine was conceived to meet major concerns of the moment, but it soon became a watchword of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was invoked in 1865 when the U.S. government exerted diplomatic and military pressure to support the Mexican president, Juarez. This support enabled Juarez to lead a successful revolt against the Emperor Maximilian, who had been placed on the throne by the French government. Keep reading. Almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors of a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect debts. Here's the key part. Focus now. Yeah. President Theodore Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in his so-called Roosevelt corollary or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine originally established American claim to dominance in the Western Hemisphere, the North and South Americas, or the American supercontinent, as we've headlined this stream. The Roosevelt corollary was not only do we claim, in principle, dominance, but we will act as a police power if that dominance is questioned. So under Roosevelt, remember, Roosevelt is the president that quipped the famous line, "Speak softly, but carry a large stick." And his point was, you can engage in diplomacy, but if anyone messes with you, then you whack them round the head. The large stick being depicted in the political cartoon that we've used for this stream. And there it is, the large stick. Now, remember, that was the Roosevelt Doctrine. Speak softly, but carry a large stick. That was the Roosevelt corollary. Now, the Trump corollary, the Donroe Doctrine, is not speak softly and carry a large stick. It's speak strongly. In other words, unity through strength. If you remember, peace through strength was the Trump slogan. Speak strongly and carry a large stick. But it's still the same doctrine, which is the Monroe Doctrine. Going back to the U.S. Naval Institute to read from that for you, from the U.S. Naval Archives, almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors of a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect debts. President Theodore Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in his so-called Roosevelt corollary or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. While the Monroe Doctrine's message was designed to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt would strengthen it, meaning to justify sending the United States into other countries of the Western Hemisphere. As a result, U.S. Marines were sent into Santo Domingo in 1904, Nicaragua in 1911, and Haiti in 1915, ostensibly to keep the Europeans out. Other Latin American nations viewed these interventions with misgiving, and relations between the great colossus of the North and its southern neighbors remained strained for many years. In 1962, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked symbolically when the Soviet Union began to build missiles missile launching sites in Cuba. With the support of the Organization of American States, President John F. Kennedy threw a naval air quarantine around the island. After several tense days, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles and dismantle the sites. Subsequently, the United States dismantled several of its obsolete air and missile bases in Turkey. So keep something in mind here, that the Monroe Doctrine not only is not new, but also has been used multiple times in the past to assert not just dominance in the North and South Americas, but also a police power, most infamously known in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US exerting power in its own back door to back the Soviet Union away from missiles that it had positioned in Cuba pointing at the US was none other than an implementation of the Monroe Doctrine. It succeeded in the end. Those who know will remember, or know, depending if you're alive then or not, that the world came perilously close to a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the US. The Monroe Doctrine is what averted that nuclear war, because it was by asserting the police power that America was able to force the Soviets to back out of Cuba, and America subsequently removed its missiles in Turkey, NATO member Turkey, that were pointed at Russia. So this doctrine has key historic precedents. Now, what is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? That is important because it specifically relates to Venezuela, right? So the Monroe Doctrine was adapted or extended by what's known as the Roosevelt corollary, as the Office of the Historian of the United States, a now defunct office, but nevertheless still has its website active, reports here. You can see on the Office of the Historian of the U.S. government's website, Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, 1904, and we just read it for you. President Theodore Roosevelt's assertive approach to Latin America and the Caribbean has often been characterized as the big stick. We mentioned that earlier. And his policy came to be known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What is the Roosevelt corollary? Although the Monroe Doctrine, it says, of 1823 was essentially passive, it asked that Europeans not increase their influence or recognize any part of the Western Hemisphere. By the 20th century, a more confident United States was willing to take on the role of regional policeman. In the early 1900s, Roosevelt grew concerned that a crisis between Venezuela and its creditors could spark an invasion of that nation by European powers. The Roosevelt corollary of December 1904 stated that the United States would intervene as a last resort to ensure that other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors and did not violate the rights of the United States or invite, quote, foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of American nations. As the corollary worked out in practice, the United States increasingly used military force to restore internal stability to nations in the region. Roosevelt declared that the United States might exercise international police power in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence. Over the long term, the corollary had little to do with relations between the Western Hemisphere and Europe, but it did serve as justification for U.S. intervention in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Now, so far, so good. We're going through it step by step. But originally, the Monroe Doctrine, before the Roosevelt corollary, in other words, before Roosevelt added American police power to the established Monroe Doctrine, without the police power, who was it enforced by? Well, it was enforced by none other than the Brits and the Great British Navy. As you can see now, again from the US Naval Institute, Monroe Doctrine Revisited. We'll just read it for you. The Monroe Doctrine did not inspire a martial crusade against Europeans. The United States remained a developing country for most of the 19th century, and its standing militarily could not impose national priorities on half the globe. But it did have a silent partner in enforcing the doctrine: Great Britain and its Royal Navy, the world's premier seaborne fighting force. British magnates had reasons of their own for keeping rival empires away from the Americas, and they had a navy able to enforce a hands-off policy. US leaders got to pursue a foreign policy doctrine of extravagant sweep while trusting someone else to enforce it. So originally, the Monroe Doctrine did have enforcement powers, but it was enforced by our Navy, the British Navy, for the Americans and for President Monroe. Eventually, once the USA got strong enough under Roosevelt, who said, speak softly but carry a big stick, he was able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine himself and asserted to the world that the American that the USA will begin its police powers in the context of the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. And Britain no longer needed to enforce it. So that's how it got developed from being a doctrine enforced by the British, that's the Monroe Doctrine, to the Roosevelt corollary enforced by the Americans in the form of a police power. Now to the second corollary, the Donroe Doctrine, not only enforced by America, but also preemptively enforced, not just at the point of a feared invasion. And this is where the Trump corollary adds to the Roosevelt Doctrine. So what we're going to say is, in response to these so-called anti-imperialists who are complaining that this is neo-conservatism revived, no, it's not. This is in fact a retreat from neo-conservatism. But we are going to say that Trump's form of retreat from neoconservative imperialism, call it imperialism if you want, is at least honest. And you can see here, we're going to cite now something that is written by one of these anti-imperialist leftists, regressive left, in Geopolitical Economy from the 5th of Jan, headlined, Donroe Doctrine. Trump attacked on Venezuela is part of the imperial plan to impose U.S. hegemony in Latin America. Well, maybe, but it's also a retreat from the rest of the world, right? And again, we'll explain why that's a good thing in a moment, including this author on your screens from the Geopolitical website. His concern about it meaning that it's imperialism within the South Americas alone. If that's the cost of retreating from the rest of the world, then that is better than World War III, is our argument. But let's read this for you. Trump has been explicit about the fact that he wants U.S. corporations to take over Venezuela's oil industry so the U.S. can meet its heavy crude needs. Brackets, replacing Canada's heavy crude exports could also give Washington leverage over Ottawa at a time when Trump talks about colonizing Canada and making it the 51st state. In a press conference held after he bombed Venezuela, Trump claimed that the US government will run the country. All right. Yep, that's true. He did say that. He added, we're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money. We're in the oil business, the US president stressed. We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. A new US-controlled supply chain for critical minerals cutting out China. Continuing in the article, in addition to enormous reserves of oil and natural gas, Venezuela also has significant deposits of gold, critical minerals, and rare earth elements. The US government has made it clear that it wants to create a new supply chain in the Western Hemisphere that cuts out China to prepare for future conflict with Beijing. It hopes it can use Latin America's critical minerals and rare earths to do so. Now, the author of that piece is one of those anti-imperialist leftists, Ben Norton, for Geopolitical Economy website. And one thing that they consistently fail at realizing is that all of their critiques against the United States of America can equally be applied to the BRICS nations that they so champion, Russia and China. And so in defense of the MAGA foreign policy in this instance, you can label it imperialism in the North and South American context. You can label it imperialism all you like, but it is factually, number one, a retreat from globalist imperialism and therefore a destruction of the globalist agenda, retreating to America's backyard, which was always its isolationist policy before America was goaded into and forced into joining World War II. And secondly, we say that if that does mean imperialism in the North and South America's context, while keeping in mind it's a retreat from globalist imperialism, then at least it's honest. And by honest, we mean unabashed. It isn't pretending to hide behind the veil of democracy and human rights. And the hypocrisy of that and the stench of that has been seen with the globalists using such a veneer to invade countries such as Iraq. And so the anti-imperialist critique of Trump's foreign policy falls short in that it is not honest with itself, because their critique of Trump can equally be applied to the powers that they support, the BRICS nations, the Russia and the China context, who also have the same designs over countries such as Venezuela. And these anti-imperialists rarely, if ever, criticize Russia and Chinese presence in these countries in the way that they criticize American presence. And again, we're going to come to that in a minute. So those are the 2 points there. It is a retreat from globalist imperialism, even if it's a domestic form of imperialism in the North and South American context. And it's also an honest form because it is not pretending to care about democracy and human rights, which again is just hypocrisy. And we've seen that with the invasion of Iraq in the past. And this brings us to the next question, which is on your screens now. Is it right? And now we're going to get to the moral question of this, because we believe it's not so much about morality as it is about preventing World War III and providing peace and stability for the world. And we're going to demonstrate this with the following. You have here somebody, here we are. Somebody asking us there on your screens, somebody asking us, does it make it right? You can see that in the middle of the screen there. And our answer to that is we posted online, actually. We'll just read it for you. So this is an answer to the question, does it make it right? Well, it's about as right as Putin's actions in Ukraine, which is to say, not right in that sense, but easy to contextualize. What do we mean? Well, for Venezuela, this is a theoretical question serving minimal practical purpose, meaning asking whether this is right or morally good is a theoretical question serving minimal practical purpose. It doesn't really get us anywhere. The operation's been conducted, and de facto, Maduro is now in detention with the Americans. Asking whether it's legal, the de jure question, is it legal? Is it right? Well, here is our answer to that. Considering Maduro stole the elections with Russian-Chinese collaboration, and hence, it is fair to say, was opposed by at least a plurality of the country as a dictator, the more relevant question is, do you prefer Venezuela to be in the Russian sphere of influence or American sphere of influence? So as to not chicken out of answering our own question, we'll give you our own answer. Ethnically Russian parts of Ukraine should go to the Russian sphere, and it is better for Venezuela to be in the US sphere. That is the answer. So forget whether it's right. And of course, by now, everyone should stop asking, is it legal? Because we all know, whether it's Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, is it legal is not a question that really these world powers give a damn about. So if you're going to start crying illegal here with Venezuela, oh, anti-imperialists, you weren't crying illegal when Russia did the same to Ukraine, right? No, you were saying it can be contextualized. Right, well, likewise, this can be contextualized. And, we know with the is it legal question by the neocons, well, they invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. We all know how that went. So let's put aside, is it legal? Yes, international law is important. Legal law graduate ourselves. Of course, international law is important, but who gets to enforce it? The UN has no right to enforce anything. Who gets to enforce international law? Well, the Monroe Doctrine says in America's key sphere of influence, the North and South Americas, only America gets to enforce it. In China's own sphere of influence, China can enforce it. In Russia's own sphere of influence, Russia can enforce it. And this is where the world is headed, which is why what we said here in our initial response, is it right, is a theoretical question. What really matters is the real question, do you prefer Venezuela to be in the Russian sphere of influence or in the American sphere of influence? Because it's a either or. If the Americas did not interfere in Venezuela, then by definition, Venezuela was already under the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence, and Maduro was doing deals with them. That was just a matter of fact. So the real question is, if your inaction means that Venezuela comes under the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence, and if your action means taking it from their sphere of influence into the American sphere of influence, the only question that matters is, do you want the Americas to be under the USA sphere of influence or under the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence? And why? Well, what we're arguing is, to avoid World War III, what makes better sense is you allow each of the great powers to have direct policing power over their own national security priorities in their own spheres of influence. And that's how you avoid the Thucydides trap. What's the Thucydides trap? Well, the Thucydides trap is another geostrategic doctrine that when one world power is rising, such as, say, China, and seeking to eclipse an established world power, such as the United States of America, how do you avoid a world war? That's the Thucydides trap. Well, this has never been answered. Every time that's been attempted, you've ended up with war. And so what Trump's trying to do is navigate it so you avoid the Thucydides trap, because war in this context means World War III. So how do you avoid it? Well, you say to the leaders of the great powers, Xi Jinping and Putin, okay, we won't interfere in your sphere of influence and you back out of ours. Ours is the Western Hemisphere, meaning North and South America. Yours can be, for example, with Putin, it can be the ethnically speaking parts of Russia. And you see this happening and playing out in real time. It's why Trump is absolutely not bothered about what parts of Ukraine Putin gets to keep. He's announced that openly, and it's why Zelensky is so infuriated, because he's not getting what he wants from Trump, because Trump doesn't give a damn about the fact that Putin's going to end up keeping the ethnically Russian parts of Ukraine, because he is going along with this idea that each great power will have policing control over its own sphere of influence, and that's how you avoid the Thucydides trap. That's how you avoid World War III. So now we've broken that down for you. You can see why it's a good thing. It's a good thing that America gets to police the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, if it means it doesn't police Russia in Ukraine, leading to World War III, which is a nuclear war, by the way, and is therefore Armageddon. What's better? America fiddles with South America or Armageddon? Now, sorry, guys, right? It is as basic as that, because we either end up with World War III, as we know, all of us, critics alike, right, that we are on the precipice of, or we settle for a new world order. And that settlement is non-interventionism in the spheres of influence of other great powers, which is the best you can get. It's not perfect. You might not like it. It could be annoying. You might not like Trump. But at least it's not World War III. And this is why we fully expect to see the great powers not interfere in what Trump's just done in Venezuela, nor what he may or may not do in the countries he's named: Mexico, Colombia, Greenland, and Canada. Whatever he ends up or does not end up doing, you will not see China and Russia militarily interfering in that region. And in return, they're expecting for Trump to leave them alone in their own spheres of influence. With Russia, it could be Ukraine. It could be, for example, Chechnya. Keep in mind, in the 90s, there was a long CIA-funded war of attrition in Chechnya against the Russian sphere of influence. It got settled in the end by allowing the Russian strongman, or the Russian-backed strongman, the Chechen strongman, that is Kadyrov, to run Chechnya. But up until Kadyrov came along, for a long, long, long time, the CIA was backing an insurrection in Chechnya against the Russians. That's all been settled, because the way forward is that the US will not interfere in the Russian sphere of influence, and in return will be left alone when it polices its own sphere of influence. That is the up-to-date 2026 Donroe Doctrine. And that's why we keep saying that we're going to see a grand regional settlement for peace, because it is the end of great powers fighting each other in their respective spheres of influence. And the implications that this has for China, we're going to come to in a minute. Now, just responding to our point here, we're reading another post that we put up at the time. Anti-imperialists, we said, do not object to kinetic Russian military presence on foreign soil, while in the same breath lamenting American imperialism. It is constantly astounding. And that is us attempting online to try and make it very clear what the hypocrisy of this anti-imperialist regressive left is. Somebody responded, a military presence agreed upon versus attack from another country. Come on. In other words, yeah, but the Venezuelans invited the Russians in. That's why they were there. But America attacked them. It's not the same thing. And our response to that was, quote unquote, invitation to any foreign power for kinetic military presence depended upon whose client was strongmanned into power last. Think a bit harder about this. I know you have it in you. So point being, yes, the Russians may have been in Venezuela, and the Chinese, upon the invitation of Maduro. But of course, it was those same Russian and Chinese powers that collaborated with Maduro to steal the elections so that he could be in power. So that invitation didn't really mean much if it was their own man who invited them, the man they installed. It's a fix, right? So it's not about invitation in this context. It is simply about whose sphere of influence is it, and which military presence do you want to see in that country? And it was either going to be Russian and Chinese or American. And clearly, it needs to be American if you want to avoid World War III. And so, finally, we're just going to explain explain one more thing, and that is that this breakdown of what's gone on, it also helps to explain why President Trump has not recognized the opposition leader, Maria Machado, to take over Venezuela, but instead has made every indication to want to collaborate with the existing Venezuelan state apparatus. Now, this is a key point that backs up our view. As you can see on your screens now from Drop Site News, President Trump declined to back Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Machado after U.S. intelligence and senior officials warned she lacked the internal leverage to govern and could trigger instability, requiring a prolonged U.S. military presence. And there you see from the news, headlined, Why Trump Refused to Back Venezuela's Machado, Fears of Chaos and Fraying Ties. And here's Trump himself saying that he would not back the Venezuelan opposition leader, but rather will work with whoever replaces Maduro from the existing regime. Remember, we said this is a retreatment from starting new wars. If you try regime change, you start a war. But if you simply engage in interventions, surgical interventions, you're able to work with whoever replaces them. Remember, we said like whack-a-mole, whoever replaces them from the internal setup. And so the Trump administration has decided not to try and replace the regime, because that will lead to chaos, but rather simply take out Maduro and work with whoever replaces him from his own backers, in this case, his vice president. And here you will have Trump saying it himself.
Of opposition leader Machado, and have you been in contact with her?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't.
Mr. President, on Monday.
Oh, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
Doesn't have the respect to govern internally. So making it very clear, what they're interested in is not, in fact, regime change. What they're interested in is stability so that they can do business. But a key thing, that stability can only come if the US guarantees that stability in Venezuela, not Russia or China, because that would be a foreign intervention in the US sphere of influence. And the last thing we'll mention here on this point is we've mentioned the implications for Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine and Chechnya, for example. But also we're going to mention the implications for China. But first up, just an example of how globalist media, corporate media have completely failed to understand any of this. Here is a post from the Spectator, the UK political magazine Spectator, quoting, in fact, from the UK newspaper, the Financial Times. Look at this. The Spectator Index says the Financial Times editorial board says that Trump's intervention in Venezuela was reckless and that America and the world will regret it. And look at our response to this, which by now you should get because we've just spent an hour explaining it. We've said quite the opposite. We've said the Financial Times editorial board and indeed the Spectator, they don't really know what they're talking about. We've said quite the opposite. But then these Muppets still think that the COVID scam was real and that Trump lost the rigged 2020 election. The shadow knows. They don't understand the world. The reason they don't understand the world is because they are governed by their own globalist ideological blinkers and their TDS. Why do they have Trump derangement syndrome, TDS? Because they are scared that Trump is upending their world and will take all of their power. And that fear leads to that angry emotional reaction as opposed to a calm and rational understanding of what the consistencies and internal logic of Trump's foreign policy are. And so as a result, they've lost their ability to read the room and read the world because their fear has turned into anger and hate, right? And it's an emotional reaction because they're losing power. So they're lashing out. The globalists have already lost, by the way. Everything you're seeing is simply a cleanup operation. The globalists have already lost. So how this impacts China? Well, there you have it. The New York Times report, 6th of January, on your screens now. It impacts China as well because as the New York Times has declared in their headline, how the Donroe Doctrine reinforces Xi's vision of power in Asia. Subheading, the US assault on Venezuela points to a world where big powers seek to call the shots in their regions. An idea Beijing knows well. And that's it. We couldn't summarize it better than that New York Times headline. Critical as they are and misunderstanding as they are of Trump, they've inadvertently landed at it there, which is the Donroe Doctrine, which is a corollary to the Roosevelt Doctrine, which is a corollary to the original Monroe Doctrine, will leave great powers to police their own spheres of influence because, of course, international law has no policeman, and nor should it, because if it had a policeman, it would be a globalist one world government. So to avoid a globalist one world government, what the Trump administration has decided is to retreat from the globalist neocon pretense of putting America in the position of being a globalist one world government, to retreat from that and instead allow the great powers to police their own spheres of interest. And by doing so, they avoid the wars that the great powers were initiating against America when, under the globalist neocons, America was trying to become the globalist policeman. And instead, by avoiding those wars, they've retreated from World War III and instead have said to Russia and China, okay, you police your own regions, we will police our own region, and that way we don't have to fight each other. So the Donroe Doctrine is the best way to avoid World War III, and that is why it's a good thing. It's as simple as that. It's a quid pro quo, and it is a zero-sum game. War and peace is a zero-sum game. So just to be clear, to avoid World War III, this is the answer. It's as simple as that. And that's what the globalist imperialists don't want to understand, because they want globalist dominance. They want a one world theocratic state. They've lost. And the rest is a cleanup operation. Thank you for your attention to this matter. You've been listening to the Warrior Creed podcast with me, the Radical Majid Nawaz. We'll be back next week at the regular time. A happy new year to you all. Please subscribe via Radical Media. Go to majidnawaz.substack.com and become paying subscribers. We cannot do this work without your support, and we do really need your paying subscriptions. Until next time, thank you for tuning in.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.